Good afternoon, and thank you to everyone for coming today. Happy to be joined by my colleague, Richard Fasha from Rhode Island. From Johnston, Rhode Island. And we're here today to talk about housing. And we are asked you here today to talk about Rhode Island's response to our housing crisis. First and foremost, while I shouldn't have to, I do feel it's necessary that I point out that House Republicans 100% agree that there is in fact a shortage of affordable housing units in the state of Rhode Island. This is a problem, and we do support strong but smart growth and development of housing. We agree that this is a fundamental problem. Our voting records may not show that we always agree with the majority's approach to solving this problem, but we cannot possibly argue that the problem doesn't exist. We're all feeling it in all of our districts. I've served on the Housing Affordability Commission now since it was conceived in 2021, and over 50 bills have passed the legislature into law and have been credited to the work of that commission. And yet, through all 5 years of these hearings, one question has persisted from various members of the commission. How many units have been built and how much has it cost? And no satisfactory answer or real answer has ever been given. The Executive Office of Housing. The Republicans made it very clear from the beginning that we believe creating more government and more bloat is going to make things more expensive, including the development of housing. Instead of streamlining the Executive Office of Housing was created legislatively. That wasn't the solution. Government bloat makes everything more expensive, including housing development. We now have two agencies. We have Rhode Island Housing and we have the Executive Office of Housing, largely duplicating efforts, essentially, metaphorically tripping over one another, trying to accomplish many of the same things. At the end of last year, I read a RIPEC report the Rhode Island Public Expenditure Council had put out. It stated that nearly $300 million had been allocated and only about 1,600 units had been produced from that. That's an abysmal return on investment. And even RIPEC was asking why no administrative streamlining was being done at Rhode Island Housing. That report is what directed me, or drove me to direct my staff to start to research how our neighbors in New England are dealing with this problem and what we look like when we compare ourselves to them. What we found is nothing short of shocking. And let's talk about staffing first. If we can put up the first graphic, you'll see. The Rhode Island Housing Agency employs 2.13 employees for every 10,000 Rhode Islanders. Massachusetts, with a population 6 times of Rhode Island's population, has just 0.51 employees per 10,000 residents. Put simply, Rhode Island has 4 times the bureaucratic load than Massachusetts for every single tax-paying resident. And if we look at administrative costs on the next graphic, Rhode Island spends $417,000 per 10,000 residents on housing administration. Vermont, the second most expensive state, spends $359,000. Massachusetts, again, much larger, spends only $109,000. Rhode Island is nearly $300,000 per 10,000 residents more expensive than Massachusetts. Let's talk about operating ratios. This next graphic will show you there's part of our regional comparison. The combined personnel and administrative costs, which total $46.4 million, are compared to $7.2 million in program spending. Rhode Island Housing indicates $52 million a year for total operation costs in FY 2026 and only $7 million on actual programs. A 7-to-1 ratio of overhead to output. At a minimum, this reflects gross inefficiency. Let's look at some of the costs per unit. Just recently, Rhode Island revealed a project, Hillcrest and Hillside. We saw a cost between $551,000 and $639,000 per unit for rehab, not construction, for rehab. Rhode Island Housing's own internal guidelines and standards dictate around $266,000 should be spent for such a project, meaning the costs of these projects were more than double their own standard. And then when we ask ourselves about oversight, in Rhode Island Housing, 4 of the 7 board seats are either expired or vacant, and some of them for years. The agency is effectively ungoverned, and some of the project approvals coming out of them are astounding. If the board is not overseeing them, who is? We just read in the paper the other day about the Judicial Nominating Committee going stagnant with their appointments. We cannot expect positive results in the state of Rhode Island from stagnant boards. We looked around the country, we saw that down in South Carolina, when public monies are being expended, certain state funds have to be rigorously reviewed, the projects are subjected to state statutory scrutiny, and it is 100% transparent to the people who fund it, the taxpayers. Rhode Island Housing is run by a stagnant board that does not appear to approve projects in keeping with Rhode Island Housing's own mission statement. As a quasi-public agency, there's no real third-party oversight of operations or expenditures. What are the measurable results? Well, since 2006, almost 20 years, Rhode Island Housing has produced or rehabilitated only 4,007 affordable units through bonds and state programs that total $516 million taxpayer dollars. And look, those figures were exceptionally difficult to get. The reporting is opaque, the information is scantily available, and as I indicated earlier, we can't get answers when we're in commission settings. So if Rhode Island Housing or anyone else has better figures than what we have, I'm happy to hear them, and it will be the first time we actually hear them from them. But the fact remains that in order to meet the 10% mandate that we ourselves set as a General Assembly in 1991, we still need 13,697 units. We argue that if those figures were updated, they would be much higher. That means Rhode Island, for the past 34 years, has failed to meet our own standard. The only conclusion that can be drawn is that there are tremendous inefficiencies and flaws in our approach to development and funding of housing development. Let's look at the payroll of Rhode Island Housing. Now, employees of quasi-public corporations are well compensated, and Rhode Island Housing is no different. The base salary of Rhode Island Housing's executive director is $229,195, which is 174% of what the median household income in the state of Rhode Island is. Affordable housing seeks to serve those making 30 to 50 to 60% of that AMI. While thousands of Rhode Islanders struggle to even find an affordable place to live, these salaries are very hard to swallow when we look at an agency that is so inefficient, yet is in charge of appropriating and administering taxpayer monies to serve those very same unhoused taxpayers. Bottom line is, while Rhode Island Housing is not a nonprofit organization, I will say this. The General Assembly created it in 1973 to address a problem, and I will quote directly from the statute and from the legislation, to address a serious shortage of safe and sanitary residential housing and shelter in the state available to and affordable by persons and families of low and moderate income, the elderly and workers and their families. The legislative intent and the expectation of Rhode Island citizens is that the majority of their revenues should be spent and dedicated to their mission, exactly how the public expects nonprofits to operate. In the nonprofit world, we see the best of them. 75 to 90% of all of their monies go directly to their mission. Even the mediocre ones, or the average performers, are spending at least 65% on program. Anything below 60%, and the watchdog agencies that look at nonprofits start to flag them for inefficiency. So if 60% gets flagged for inefficiency, we have to point out that Rhode Island Housing is at 13%. 13% of their funds go to actual projects. At the end of the day, there isn't really a standard for Rhode Island Housing. because FHAs, or HFAs, the housing finance agencies, make it very difficult to determine if there is an industry standard. So we can't compare them to their industry. And look, this ratio may line up with their internal goals and needs, but it certainly does not align with the needs of the people of the state of Rhode Island who are finding themselves unhoused or underhoused at this point in time. We are 52 years out from the creation of Rhode Island housing, and the concerns of the state and our citizens, which prompted the creation of Rhode Island housing, are largely the same. We've seen no change. As the minority leader, I want to properly address housing, but I'm not in a position to directly change the direction the state's going in. We all know that. However, it is my obligation to point out to the people of Rhode Island that their state government is failing them in this mission. If housing truly is a crisis, as the governor, as the leadership of the House, as the leadership of the Senate, as the advocates, and as the media have all proclaimed, and we proclaim that it is as well in the House Republican caucus, why has it been allowed to get this bad? If part of the solution was to create the Executive Office of Housing, why haven't all the state's housing functions been centralized under that authority, including the financing administration aspect currently done by Rhode Island Housing? If part of the solution was to pass the Quasi-Public Corporations Accountability and Transparency Act in 2014, why hasn't Rhode Island Housing been called out on the growth and sheer scope of their administrative costs? The people of Rhode Island, too many of them unable to afford a place to live, have entrusted policymakers with hundreds of millions of their precious taxpayer dollars to build housing. But what it has been built instead is an upper middle class jobs creation program at Rhode Island Housing and similar agencies, and no action has been taken to change this. Rhode Island spends more, wastes more than any other New England state, and it delivers less, and it's not even close. Some calls to action the Republican caucus is taking. First, we demand an audit. We're calling for a full performance and forensic audit of Rhode Island Housing, either by the Auditor General or the Office of Internal Audit and Program Integrity. But let me also be clear, for decades there's been a nonpartisan group between the House and the Senate calling for an Inspector General in the state of Rhode Island, and this, quite frankly, would be the perfect thing for that office to look at. Be that as it may. The Auditor General answers directly to JCLS and to the Speaker of the House, who's made housing his #1 policy priority for the past 5 years. The Speaker can make this audit happen, and I've asked him to do that. Also, the governor in this year's budget proposal proposed that we enhance the Office of Internal Audit and Program Integrity with subpoena power, and we have. The legislature approved it, it's law. Perhaps he ought to use that to get to the bottom of this. In fact, if the governor wishes to remain consistent, we just heard him the other day on the news talking about our collapsing healthcare system, and he said we need to focus on the costs in the administrative area in healthcare. And the Republicans agree with the governor on that, and it applies here as well. If statutory barriers exist because Rhode Island Housing is a quasi-public agency, then let's remove them statutorily. We saw when Citizens Bank was going to leave, we acted like this, and we changed statutes and we kept them here. If we can act quickly to save banks, we can act quickly to house Rhode Islanders who are living on the streets. Second, we need to rethink our approach. Our Rhode Island affordable housing laws have been in place since 1991, and our approach has not changed at all. That's a failure of leadership for over 3 decades. 2 weeks ago, we were all asking what could have been done to keep Hasbro in Rhode Island. I don't want to be 4, 3, 5 years down the road asking that same question. What could have been done to create more housing in Rhode Island after all of the money we've bonded is gone? We need to build houses now. We can't wait. We need to build homes and not bureaucracies. And perhaps it's time we admit that Rhode Island Housing has failed at its mission. Perhaps it's time that we move the financing functions of that agency into the Executive Office of Housing, where programs are actually subjected to House finance hearings, legislative oversight, and where there's some transparency. We don't need two agencies duplicating efforts. We need results. It's time to stop throwing money at the problem and start focusing on efficiency, accountability, and outcomes. The people of Rhode Island, the taxpayers deserve this. In closing, the housing crisis in Rhode Island is undeniable. The gap between the number of affordable units available and the area median income is growing every single year. Families are struggling to afford homes while the state builds bloated agencies, gold-plated projects, and duplicate bureaucracies. Republicans are offering solutions: consolidation, accountability, audits, and results. And House Republicans are dedicated to working with our Democratic colleagues to bring the efficiency, efficacy, and results that the taxpayers expect in all of our agencies and efforts. We cannot afford another decade of waste while our neighbors all across New England outpace us in efficiency, oversight, and housing production. It's time for Rhode Island to catch up and start building homes, not bureaucracies. Thank you, and I will take questions.
Leader Chippendale, it appears that these same failures bedevil the not-for-profit sector, and I'm talking in terms of high salaries, high administrative costs. They bedevil organizations like the quasis, like the cap agencies. They certainly are written all over the statewide projects. Is it time simply, and by the way, we're about to retool the coordinated entry system again. Is it time to start to remove some of this from government and put it into some level of competitive free enterprise?
So that's a really good question, Pat. And, you know, as I was preparing for this, I was thinking to myself, as a Republican, I should not be advocating for functions to be put into a government agency like I did with the Executive Office of Housing. That's one of the claims I made. That is contrary to what you would typically hear Republicans say, because we don't believe government can do things better than the private market. But quasi-publics are this two-headed beast that does not seem to ever achieve the efficiency that's necessary. In the purest sense, from the beginning, I have stated if we want to solve the housing crisis in Rhode Island, government needs to get out of the way of the private developers and let them do what they do and what they know how to do, which is build houses. So, yes. Any other questions?
Oh, yeah, on the other side of that, there's the RIPAC report talks about a public option, or a public builder, right?
Yes.
And they suggest that maybe the state should just get involved in building these things themselves, like cut out the middleman and just put up houses.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
I wouldn't necessarily urge the state to take that on, Steve, but I have even proposed in my own hometown that we do take on a public developer model in a certain sense. And the reason why is that I believe that our individual municipalities know those populations and those municipalities better than anyone else. Right. And if that public developer model, as it's called, is embraced by certain municipalities, I think we would see a marked increase in not just affordable units, but we'll see accessible, grade level, elderly handicap accessible units, and that will relieve the burden by getting folks, elderly folks and other folks who are otherwise trapped in their homes, out and put those homes out into the market for our youngsters who are trying to set themselves up in the state to buy, rehab, increase the tax rolls. So there's absolute viability in that, yes.
So you'd like to see it done at municipal, not state level?
I would prefer that, yeah.
Thank you.
Leader Chippendale, isn't there also kind of the problem from a lot of municipalities kind of standing in the way of more development?
That has been an ongoing conversation. There's no doubt that that municipalities have their own visions, and sometimes those visions don't necessarily align with the legislative approaches they see coming out of here. But I don't want that to necessarily derail the message here today, which is one element. That's one element. You're absolutely right on that. Another element is the agency that we are counting on for controlling $516 million bonded taxpayer dollars, which we know once the VIG is paid off is probably going to be close to $1 billion. They are not properly administering that money. A quasi-public agency that is spending 13% of everything on their their mission is failing. They're spending 87% to basically keep their employees there and their lights on. And we saw on the charts that we are grossly out of line with all of our New England neighbors. The state of Massachusetts, to which Rhode Island leaders compare our state all the time, and we use them as a standard, as a benchmark as to what we should go after, whether it's housing, whether it's jobs, whether it's biotech, whether it's education. We're constantly referring to them. We have 2.13 employees per 10,000. They have 0.51. Why don't we try to emulate them there? If their housing agency can operate on that kind of a margin with their employees, why can't ours? That is a top-heavy, inefficient organization, and I dare say that if that were a private company, on the stock market, they'd be out of business. Their shareholders would be pulling their money out of there. That is not an efficient operation.
A question on the chart. We've got like over 50 million in the pie chart here. What bucket of money is that specifically? Because as you've mentioned, they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars, more than 50. So that's got to be a subset of.
So part of the General Assembly's statute that created them, we established them to be a self-sufficient agency, right? So that means they can collect administration fees, they can collect interest on loans, they can sell loans that they're managing. These are all means by which they can bring capital into their organization to remain self-sufficient and to build housing. So that's what you see there. It does not even include what the taxpayers have bonded. That is simply what they bring in per the statute, and what they put out does not match, again, what I read in the statute. I did not read the entirety of Rhode Island Housing's mission statement, but it's a Google away. I urge you to read it, and then I urge you to ask yourself if you think they're true to their mission statement. And I would plainly state that they're not.
And then sort of, on those bigger picture things, I mean, I'm guessing they're obviously not here to answer, but what I understand is one of their answers for why they have such a big staff and spend so much is that there are a lot of competing interests that they try to satisfy in these projects. They're not just trying to build the maximum number of units, they're trying to get them to the lowest income people, and also that there's retail, daycare, and there's all of this matrix of different things they're trying to accomplish. And that complexity leads to higher spending and more administrative work. Also trying to prove that they're not wasting the money. They have to hire all these people to fill out all the paperwork and do all that stuff. So do you think that there just needs to be a simplifying of the mission to just build more units as the bottom line and not so many different goals?
So I think, first of all, we need to they need to fill their board. If the board is going to be what's governing them, they need to fill it, first of all. They need to replace the people who are stagnant. And I can't imagine that any board on a quasi-public who's being loyal to the mission of that quasi-public would approve a project like Hillsdale or Hillside, which, again, were rehabs that cost, I'm going from memory, so don't hold me on this, you heard my true comments earlier, twice what their own standards are calling for. And a lot of those costs came because they embraced resilient or green building. If I am unhoused, I don't care if it was built with resilient materials or renewable materials. I care that I'm sleeping on the street in the winter and I want a house. We should not be spending, again, administering through this agency, $551,000 or whatever that ridiculous amount was that I quoted earlier on rehabbing a unit. We could be building new units with that money instead of rehabbing and feeling good about ourselves for being green. That's not going to address the homelessness problem, and that's not going to address the affordability of housing problem in this state. I don't know if I answered your question because I know I took it in a slightly different direction. Please feel free to.
That got to part of it, but
And so as far as your question regarding, there are people to do this, there are people to do that. So does Massachusetts, so does Maine. And if you think of Maine is far more spread out. Massachusetts is 6 times larger. Vermont's far more spread out. they are efficiently doing this. Why can't we? We can drive anywhere we need to in the state of Rhode Island. In Mass, in Maine, and you might not be able to, but they're still able to administer their housing finance authority with exponentially fewer employees. That is not a, what about this paperwork, what about that paperwork? That is bloat. That is a middle-class jobs creation program that the taxpayers of this state, that the legislature created, and that the taxpayers of this state are not getting what they need from.
Is there a sense in which this might be seen as industry capture, that they're favoring certain builders or certain?
You know, I look for things like that, right? I'm the minority, I'm looking for anything like that. I don't know that I've necessarily seen that. What I have heard from builders, and whether they're, you know, the builder who nobody has ever heard of or the builder who everyone has heard of, they are so consistent in what they're asking for, Steve. They want government out of their way. They want a process that is contiguous. Not consecutive. They want all of their applications to be being reviewed in the same time, not this one first, this one next, that one next. Our bureaucratic approach in the state has made it unaffordable for developers to build. And we can throw all the money we want at it. We are all very familiar, and me painfully familiar, with the issue with the Pallet Village, with Echo Village. And all of my guffaws aside on that whole issue, we spent $102,000 to build, per bed, to build 45 beds that are empty right now because it's not the winter, understandably it's not. But we're not using the money wisely or efficiently. Pat?
Yeah, tax stabilizations, despite the fact that they are clear evidence of a failed tax system, continue to proliferate in Rhode Island.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is, if in fact those TSAs are geared largely towards luxury housing, isn't in fact both the government at the state level and municipal level actually skewing the market to provide luxury housing?
Yeah, I mean, so the counter argument to that is, for every luxury house you build, you're freeing up a lower end house. Somebody's moving upward, and that's ultimately what we all want. I can only speak for myself. You know, my first house was a very, very modest house in a place that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life, and I worked hard, and I got to the next place, and I got to the next place. That's what we want, right? So we need to have those. Rhode Island's a beautiful state. We need to have those beautiful homes, right? And if they build them, they're freeing up the homes on the bottom end of the scale. I don't necessarily see that as bad. But that's not our focus. That's happening, but that's not the focus. The focus should be building housing that is affordable.
But ultimately, aren't a lot of folks moving from that estate, COVID moving forward, to inhabit those luxury housing because they've created an artificial platform that's clearly above this economic level of the average Rhode Islander, while at the same time taking builders' resources away from providing a clear, viable product for the lower income.
So here's the rub with that. We are relying, and I think it's appropriate as a state, we are relying on private builders to build the housing for us. Private builders don't build housing out of the goodness of their heart, although that is an element with some of them. I've met builders whose goals are truly altruistic. But they need to have a margin in there to keep their lights on too. So when they do these mixed income projects or mixed use projects, you know, some commercial, some affordable, some market rate, there has to be enough of a market rate element in there for them to meet the margins on building the affordable units. So we can't have purely affordable focus unless it's 100% subsidized and run through the state or something along those lines. Private developers have to make a profit. And I know that's a bad word for a lot of people, but without them, no houses are being built. I got time for one more. I want to take one if there is any more.
Was there any, most of this seems like execution issues, audits, figuring out where the money goes, efficiency. Is there anything statutory that you think the General Assembly next year needs to do on this? Other than Inspector General, that's a given.
Yeah, no, and that was just a gratuitous opportunity for me to harp on something that's really important to me. You know, the only thing statutorily I would say we may need to look at is if there is anything that would prevent our Auditor General or the Office of Integrity, Program Integrity, to look at a quasi-public. If there's impediments to them being able to do that, then statutorily we should remove those impediments. I don't altogether, and again, I referenced that I don't support all of the housing bills that have come out of the commission, and I can articulate why on each of them on an individual basis. But I don't think they've all been bad. I think we have removed a lot of bureaucracy through some of this legislation, and of course, I'm always going to ask that we invest more in eliminating bureaucracy, because bureaucracy costs money. So when we eliminated the Housing Appeal Board, that was great. We got rid of this inefficient agency, another agency whose board went stagnant, commission members weren't being appointed and everything else. It was just dragging things down. We're moving to the e-permitting, slow process, but great process. We've offered fellows to our municipalities to help them understand planning and housing. These are all good moves and good investments of taxpayer money. But when the agency that operates the financing element of it is so over cost burdened just to keep the lights on, I have to question if those necessary funds are trickling down to complement the good steps that have come out of us as a legislature. And I just don't think that they are. And I think, and look, I have no bone to pick with Rhode Island housing. These numbers just stuck out so absurdly that we had to research them. Again, I have no issue. They've been a great resource in our state when we have housing issues in our districts. But I can't support a 7-to-1 ratio and with a happy smile on my face. I can't do it, especially when I can look at Massachusetts. They have a half an employee, we have 2.13 employees. Doesn't work.
One more?
Sure, Steve.
RIPTA has had 6 or 7 efficiency studies in the last 15 years, I think. Like, no other agency, public-private, has gotten that at all.
Yeah, I would love to see more of them.
Yeah.
RIPTA, we could probably have a whole other 2-hour press conference on where we feel about, what we feel about them and where we think we should go with them. But no, and that's right, Steve. We should always, I think, look in the mirror as a state. And we clearly have the Auditor General, we have the Office of Program Integrity. These are tools that we should be using. And when we see a 7-to-1 ratio, when we see a pie chart that ugly, we need to start using those tools.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, everybody. I really
Thank you
appreciate
for
it.
coming.